Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Piano TV. I'm Allysia, your host, and today we're going to be looking at the incidental music by Felix Mendelssohn for Shakespeare's very famous A Midsummer Night's Dream. There are 14 movements in this collection, including an overture and an ending. And what we're going to be doing today, as we tend to do with these type of videos, is talk about a few key parts, listen to some examples, and just I'm here to help you get a sense of the work as a whole. And we'll talk a little bit of backstory too, starting now. Let's head to it. Mendelssohn completed the incidental music to A Midsummer Night's Dream in 1842, but he actually wrote the overture when he was only 17 years old, which was 16 years before he completed the whole incidental music set. But in spite of that, it's still remarkably seamless. Mendelssohn and his musically talented sister Fanny were both huge fans of Shakespeare, and they particularly enjoyed A Midsummer Night's Dream. Mendelssohn ended up being commissioned by King William Frederick IV of Prussia to write the music for this play. Among the 14 movements that we're going to look at roughly half of them. One of them is one of the most famous musical compositions of all time that most of you are probably familiar with. It is the Wedding March. We'll definitely have a listen to that. Some of the music for A Midsummer Night's Dream involves vocals, while other movements are purely instrumental. So the vocal selections include You Spotted Snakes, and the melodramas Over Hill Over Dale, The Spells, etc. You'll find echoes of the overture throughout these, which was Mendelssohn's way of making all of the music coherent. Now, the instrumental movements, so the Scherzo, Intermezzo, Nocturne, and Wedding March, are usually played with the overture at the beginning if a symphony is doing just like a purely concert performance of the music. And just to give you like a quick rundown, and then we'll get into this in a little bit more detail, but the overture is what kicks everything off in the play, Act 1, entirely without music. Then we have the Scherzo, which is lively, and it basically acts as like an intermezzo between the first and second acts, which leads us to our first melodrama, which is spoken words over music, followed by a fairy march, and then at the second scene of Act 2, we have the song with choir, which, there it is, Lied mit Chor. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but that is You Spotted Snakes. And then at the end of the second act is another intermezzo down here. And then Act 2, there's a march followed by music derived from the overture. And then we have the Nocturne, which just has this like absolutely beautiful solo horn passage, which is meant to accompany the sleeping lovers between the third and fourth acts. Then we have a melodrama in the fourth act, and then there's a reprise of the Nocturne. Another intermezzo between Act 4 and 5, and then finally we have the very famous Wedding March. In Act 5, it's just like pumped full of music because there's a wedding and everyone's partying. There's also a funeral march parody, and then which you can see right here, and then a dance of clowns, the Bergamask, a short allegro, and then we have the finale. All right, so let's take a look at the instruments used. So the overture and incidental music use the following instruments, which you see on the screen. We got some flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, horns, trumpets. There's basically no trombones in the overture, but then they're added to the rest of the incidental music. Timpani, strings, some rhythm instruments, which are added to the incidental music. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So this play, because it's Shakespeare, is often performed in English because, Shakespeare was English. Mendelssohn actually composed the music to fit both Shakespeare's English text and the German translation, which he was familiar with, being German. So what we're going to do is listen to several of the musical numbers from this play, and then we're going to discuss them, and it'll be a lot of fun. Let's get started. The Overture, Opus 21, which a very young and brilliant Mendelssohn wrote at the age of 17, sets the enchanted tone for the entire play, is written in the key of E major. It was originally conceived as just a concert overture, which basically means it wasn't meant to be connected to any performance of the play, but that would come 2 decades later when he wrote the rest of the music for the play. Despite Mendelssohn being a Romantic era composer, he draws a lot from classical elements in many of the movements in here, including the overture, which is written in sonata form. We start with 4 held chords with the wind instruments, and then we have our first theme in E major, which is followed by a theme in E, well, it's not a theme, it's kind of just like a second part, in E minor, which is the parallel minor of E major. And this part is representing the dancing fairies, and this theme will come back again and again. After that, we have the second theme, which is the lover's theme, another one that will recur throughout the entire performance, essentially. And then the donkey, we have like a hee-hawing of the strings a little bit later on. We're not going to listen to that in today's example, but just if you end up listening to the whole thing, this is kind of a cool effect. Fun fact, this overture premiered in Stettin, Prussia, and it was actually the first premiere that Mendelssohn ever had since he was so young. And he had to trek 80 miles in a raging snowstorm to get there. So that is hardcore Mendelssohn. Let's have a brief listen to the exposition of the overture so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. After the first musicless act, we have an intermezzo, which is where we have the Scherzo, and we're going to listen to that in a second. And this has a very playful and like elfin-like quality to it, which is fitting because it comes right before Puck is introduced to the story. The Scherzo, like many scherzos, is fast, fun, lively, and this one features kind of like a little bit of dancing interplay between strings and woodwinds. It introduces to us the fairy world, and there are these running passages in a minor key with the woodwind, which is actually, it kind of calls back to the fairy theme in the strings from the overture. And like the overture, this has a classical element. It's written in sonata form. Let's have a listen to the beginning. Moving on, the next selection we're going to be listening to is the only vocal selection that I'll be sharing with you. All the other ones are instrumental. And this one is You Spotted Snakes. It's a song with choir. And basically what's happening in the story is Titania is asleep and Oberon is like squeezing flowers in her eyes or something like that, doing an incantation. The fairies are singing about protecting their queen and so on. So let's have a listen to the recording. It is in German, and I know I mentioned this like in other parts of this video, but if you do have a chance to watch the play as a whole, it's really, really fun. Just make sure you get English translation or English subtitles, assuming you speak English. And then while the lovers are sleeping between Act 3 and 4, we hear a very beautiful instrumental nocturne, which features a lovely romantic horn melody. In this nocturne, Oberon is forcing Puck to basically repent and right his many wrongs. Let's have a listen. This is probably my favorite one in the whole set. It's very dreamy. And then we reach the famous wedding march. It introduces the fifth and final act of the play. Hermia is married to Lysander, Helena to Demetrius, Hippolyta to Theseus. Basically lots of weddings and lots of partying. It opens with the instantly recognizable trumpet fanfare. I just have like a little piano version up on the screen right now, but it would open with trumpets. The main theme is interspersed with a couple trio sections, and then in the final version of the main theme, and I'm just saying this if you end up listening to the whole thing, we hear these like little twittering flutes and strings, which are reminding us that the fairies were involved in the matchmaking of these marriages. Queen Victoria was personally acquainted with Mendelssohn and was a huge fan of his music. And she really loved his wedding march, so much so that when her daughter got married to
German Emperor Frederick III
in 1858, she selected the wedding march to be played at her daughter's wedding, who was Princess Victoria. And pretty much ever since then, it's been a really popular selection at weddings, being played, probably thousands upon thousands of times. The wedding march is in the key of C major, and it exists in many versions. What you'll often hear at weddings is like a pipe organ version, depending on if it's at a church or not. But guys like Liszt actually created virtuoso transcriptions of it for the piano. Liszt, I've talked about this before on this channel when I talk about Liszt, but he really liked transcribing orchestral pieces by other composers for solo piano, but they're usually really insanely hard. And actually, Vladimir Horowitz, who is a legendary piano performer, also had his own version of the wedding march for piano that he would do for encores in his performances. So let's have a listen, though I'm sure you already know this one. Toward the end of the final act, we have a comedic version of a funeral march, and then after that, Nick Bottom asks, "Will it please you to see the epilogue or to hear a Bergamask dance between two of our company?" And then he's talking to Theseus, who refuses the epilogue but invites the Bergamask. Now, a Bergamask, which is a dance of clowns in this play, is kind of just like a silly, goofy song, essentially. It's meant to sound like it's not being silly, but it's totally silly. Maybe it'll make sense once you hear it. This is essentially a reprise of Nick Bottom's Donkey Dance from the Overture, and it's followed by like a very brief little allegro musical passage, which then leads to the very end of the play. So this is the last musical selection we'll be listening to. And that concludes today's discussion on Mendelssohn's Midsummer Night's Dream, both the overture and the incidental music. Even though we only listened to about half of the 14 movements, hopefully, and like tiny snippets of that, hopefully this gave you a better understanding of Mendelssohn's music. And as I mentioned already, definitely, if you have the time, sit down and watch a full performance of it. It's kind of like with Mozart's comic operas. They're just a lot of fun. Just make sure you have English subtitles so you're able to like actually follow along with the story. It's a little harder with Shakespeare because the language is a little bit more Shakespearean. Mozart's operas are generally like really great to start with if you haven't really ever watched any old musical things like that before, but very much worth watching, very entertaining. And with that, I will sign out. I have never said that before. That sounds very internet-y, which I guess is suiting to being on YouTube. So thank you so much for watching today's video. Give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye, guys. Basically the background music, and like, I guess not just the background music for I'm just gonna start again.